On April 26, 2024, my world changed. After seeing Challengers for the first time, I remember walking out of that theater a changed woman. Honestly, like an hour into the movie, I think I realized I would never be the same again. Granted, I've always been prone to obsessions. Pretty normal for me not to be normal about the things I love. But this time felt different. And I couldn't explain why. Hello, hello. My name is Olivia, and welcome to my first video on this channel. I'm not gonna lie, because it's my first video, there will probably be so many errors and it's not gonna be very polished, but I'm so happy you're here because I've been wanting to start a video essay channel for a while now, and I figured what better place to start than with this piece of media that has somehow taken over my entire life and consciousness. I wish I was joking, but honestly, no, I take it back, I don't, because then I wouldn't be here discussing this incredibly important film critically with you now. Like, Challengers, you will always be famous, and I don't care about that Oscar snub. I mean, I do care about the Oscar snub, but Challengers Nation rise. No, but seriously, the fact that Challengers has embedded itself so deeply in my psyche is definitely something worth interrogating. In some ways, it feels like it's existed as a part of my psyche since before it even had a name. Like, this movie was made for me, and not to be dramatic, it occupies a primordial place in my mind. Like, there has been a spot reserved for this movie there since the beginning of time. I may be a bit prone to exaggeration, but I'm also right. There is something deeply personal to me about this movie, and I can't even lie to you, it's probably just as obvious as you think. I mean, I'm certainly not alone in calling this one of the sexiest movies to come out of 2024. I'm a simple woman. I have simple needs. I see three incredibly hot people engage in a deeply psychosexual, dramatic relationship that extends across half their lifetimes. I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna watch, and I'm gonna enjoy it to an equally freaky degree. Like, sue me. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I would probably advise you to watch this biblical level psychotic romance before returning to this video, because there will in fact be many spoilers, and there's nothing like seeing this movie for the first time. But, like, in case you just want to come along for the ride, that's totally fine. I'll offer you a preliminary summary of the film's events. As IMDb states, Challengers is about Tashi, a former tennis prodigy turned coach who transforms her husband, Art, into a champion. But to overcome a recent losing streak and redeem himself, he'll need to face off against his former best friend and Tashi's ex-boyfriend, Patrick. This primary conflict unfolds across multiple connecting timelines, chronologically beginning in 2006 and ending in 2019. The audience is introduced to the three main characters, Tashi, Art, and Patrick, near the end of their story as Art and Patrick face off in the aforementioned tennis match, while Tashi watches from the stands. What's eventually revealed within the admittedly confusing timeline is how they all met as teenagers at the Junior US Open. This 2006 sequence begins with Art and Patrick winning their doubles tournament and falling into each other's arms lovingly, as best friends do, and discussing their upcoming singles final match against each other the next day. They then go to watch Tashi absolutely demolish the girls' singles tournament while they discuss how hot she is and attempt to conceal their longing. Later that night, at an Adidas after party in her honor, they compete for her affection, talk about tennis on the moonlit beach, both ask for her number, and invite her back to their hotel room. She denies it at first because she's not a homewrecker, to which Art argues they don't actually live together, and Patrick declares it an open relationship, which I'm like completely fine and totally normal about, by the way, in case you were wondering. But Tashi does eventually show up that night, and this is where things get spicy. They all sit on their hotel room floor, drinking beer and talking about tennis, when Tashi asks them about their relationship with each other, hinting at if they've ever, hooked up. Art denies it. They're just besties, duh. But Patrick reveals the cute story, his words, not mine, of how he taught Art how to jerk off when they were both 12. They all laugh it off for a bit until Tashi moves to sit on the bed, summons for them to join her on either side, and proceeds to make out with them both. First Art, then Patrick, then together, then just Art and Patrick. Oh, Tashi, girl, I see you, the freak that you are. But Tashi, a woman much stronger than myself, interrupts, goes to leave, and then at their protests, tells them that whoever wins their singles match the next day can have her number. Long story short, Patrick wins the match and her number, and Art, feeling incredibly left out a few days later, asks Patrick to give him a signal, to serve like him, to put the ball directly in the center of the racket, to confirm if they've hooked up or not, which Patrick does, of course, much to Art's chagrin. Though, interesting side note, in the screenplay, Art is also pissed because Patrick can serve just as well as him, like, without doing his own little freaky move. Like, I love that detail because it, like, reveals the inherent competition that Art feels with Patrick, even though, like, I would argue Patrick doesn't always look at it the same. Obviously, a lot transpires after this moment. Tashi breaks her knee playing at Stanford. Tashi and Patrick break up. Patrick and Art break up. Art and Tashi hook up a few years later, professionally and romantically, and Patrick and Tashi hook up twice more after that. And Patrick reveals all of this to Art at the match point of the game using the same signal they came up with when they were kids. It's a thrilling drama full of cleverly placed twists and turns, even more amped up by Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor's techno wet dream score, which should have won a fucking Oscar, but we don't have to talk about that. And I'm stopping here because my summary of the entire movie, it simply won't do it justice, and you should do us both a favor and just go watch this movie. It's incredible and you won't regret it, and then you can come back to this video and have even more context. But I'm also stopping here specifically because this flashback sequence is the pinnacle of the movie for me. And no, not just for the reasons you think, get your mind out of the freaking gutter. It's because it's where all the corners of the love triangle touch, as Luca Guadagnino, the film's director, puts it. It's the only instance, besides perhaps the very end of the movie, that all the characters fully let loose their longing for each other. I find their dynamic in these moments really interesting because it shapes where these characters ultimately end up. Patrick's hubris, Art's repression, and Tashi's control are certainly all incredibly relevant to this character-driven plot, yet it's in the ways that they find release in each other, in their relationships with one another, that I see myself most reflected in these otherwise extremely unrelatable and privileged characters. In the interplay between their distinct characteristics and archetypes, I see a representation of a broader human experience. In the place where all the corners touch, I hear a message that speaks to me personally. The big bi agenda. What I really mean by this is that in each of these characters, I see a representation of an aspect or potential stereotype of bisexuality, which together interlock to paint a broader picture of bisexuality in a cultural sense. This is apparent not only in the film's writing and direction, but in the audience reception. If it wasn't already obvious, I identify as bi, and so does my plant over here, if you couldn't tell, which is probably why I think I take some of the critiques of the film and these characters a little too personally, I can admit it. Like, of course shitty people can be bi and bi people can be shitty, but I'm not actually interested in moralizing their behavior. Even the screenwriter Justin Kriskis has said, this film doesn't have a villain. I ultimately agree with this take, but I would argue that the true villain of this film is heteronormativity and compulsory monogamy. In that way, these characters behave the way they do, not due to some moral failing, but because of the difficult conditions they find themselves in. It's not that they're shitty people because they're bi, but that the adversity they face because of their bisexuality makes them behave in shitty ways. I personally think this take on the film is more interesting than simply pointing fingers at who's the good guy or bad guy. Infidelity, for example, will always be bad. I'm definitely not arguing it's not, but it's worth interrogating the conditions that make such infidelity possible in the first place. Now, I also know some people won't read these characters as bi as I do, besides maybe Patrick. I don't think there's any harm in arguing they're bi. I mean, it's 2025, it's a pretty common practice to queer characters in media, but also the very fact that their bisexuality can be questioned, that it's seemingly invisible without enough proof, is a very familiar bi experience to anyone who knows. In that way, the film is potent with big bad bi energy. It's like, you know the blue tint in Twilight? It's like that. There's just this like bi tint over the whole movie that colors the characters and themes present. So yes, I am arguing that Art, Tashi, and Patrick are all incredibly bi, and each represent something unique and misunderstood about the bi experience, which to me is evident in the misunderstandings of the conflicting characters themselves. But you know what? Let's just get into it. Patrick Zweig. I think Patrick is the most obvious to start with. His motives appear the most immediately transparent, and his sexuality is an already emphasized element of his character. While I'm not really interested in gathering evidence of the character's canon bisexuality, there's a whole dark history and context for that precedent that I don't really want to get into right now, at least not yet. When it comes to Patrick, he seems the most obviously bi. I mean, in the locker room scene when he's scrolling for Tinder dates to crash with, for example, Kritzky's points out that though he's not particularly interested in any of them, he swipes on both men and women, which means his Tinder settings were likely already set to both. His yearning for art, both early on and later in life, is also pretty apparent to anyone with eyes, methinks, but that's just me. Patrick also takes on an antagonistic role within a large part of the movie. He pisses people off, he's a thorn in everyone's side, he's gratuitous and over the top, and he's incredibly immature, as both Art and Tashi love to tell him on multiple occasions. What's interesting about this element of his character, though, is that it's a characteristic often used to describe bisexual people. Somehow bisexuality is seen as something marked by youth. It's an experiment, not an identity. This perspective was parroted to me and my bi friends many times throughout my teens, that we would grow out of it. You'll see. This idea has been so pervasive in our culture for so long that even everyone's favorite weirdo had something to say about it. Oh, Sigmund Freud, the man that you are. Freud considered bisexuality to be a primordial state of being, which basically meant that he believed that we are all bisexual as children and eventually grow out of it, making bisexuality, by its very nature, childish and immature. This recontextualizes Art's comment in the sauna.
I always tried to figure out what happened to you, but the more I've thought about it, the more I realize it's what didn't happen. You never grew up.
With this comment, it's clear that Art blames Patrick's failures on his immaturity here. But with the bi tint permeating the entire film, it's interesting to explore what exactly Art defines as immature. When Patrick admits that he's missed playing with him, for example, Art tells him, puffing up his chest all hot and bothered, "Well, I don't miss playing with you, man. I'm too old for it." In other words, Art believes he has outgrown Patrick and their homoerotic friendship, in the same way that Freud believed we were all meant to outgrow our childish bisexuality. That Art chose Tashi, that he chose at all, is what makes him more mature and thus more worthy of success. I mean, of course, there is some truth to this, in the sense that Art is only as successful as he is because of Tashi and her coaching. I fully believe that Patrick could have found himself in the same position as Art if he was smart enough to take Tashi's coaching advice in the first place, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? Patrick would never make this choice. As the most openly bi character among them, Patrick has decided not to choose, and his childish decision frames all of his character's shortcomings. Because it's not just that Patrick is immature. He's also selfish, self-absorbed, and let's not forget, so slutty. I mean, look at those shorts. Yet this is another common stereotype painted of bi people. A 2011 study by Christian Kless found that bisexual people are often characterized as shady characters, untrustworthy partners, and promiscuous sluts. Honestly, all of these admonitions seem like they could describe Patrick Zweig. There's just something to the fact that he's the most visibly bi and the most despised among them. Tashi and Art love to paint him as the villain, when really he's just a horny bisexual that forces them to confront their own conflicting desires. There is something to that, though, the relevance of desire. It's interesting because according to Julia Shaw in her book, Bi, The Hidden Culture, History, and Science of Bisexuality, she says, people see bisexuality as something sexual and personal, rather than an identity. It's in the way that people often equate bisexuality to threesomes. It's something you do rather than something you are. And that behavior is regarded as greedy, an excess of desire whose lack of containment threatens to permeate into even the most innocent social interactions. Which is honestly why bi men are further stigmatized as HIV bridges, transferring HIV from the homosexual community to the straight community. In this way, the real threat Patrick poses to Art and Tashi's marriage is one of affliction, that he could disrupt the sanctity of their lives with his promiscuity and spread desire into them like a plague. This perspective also kind of explains why Patrick is always low-key portrayed as dirty or grimy, in my opinion. But obviously this language is a super problematic way to describe bisexuality. But that's also part of the point I'm trying to make. To point out the ways that the character's bisexuality and internalized biphobia define not only their interactions with each other, but their reception by the audience. Patrick is characterized by some of the more negative stereotypes of bisexuality, primarily his immaturity and promiscuity, which is why he's seemingly so misunderstood. It's not that he's not immature or promiscuous. I mean, he often owns these parts of himself. It's just that the way in which they're painted is contextualized by his visible bi-ness. It is an ever-present element of his character that serves to contrast the others. It's why he's so good at getting under their skin, because he reflects the part of themselves that they deny. I mean, I also think he's a Leo, but that's just an aside. But this leads me into the next section to interrogate the man that best embodies this denial, the ice to Patrick's fire, Art Donaldson. Alright, I'll be upfront with y'all. It's my first YouTube video, so there's bound to be some bumps in the road, and I've definitely run into a few. One of them being that I wanted to film this video all in one go with my little I told you getup, but my camera's battery can't really do that, so I decided I'd do it in installments, and rather than it obviously be a different day where I'm just wearing the same thing, I had dreams of dressing up as each of the characters, but then I was like, I don't really have the funds to just go out and buy different outfits for all of them. Like, I already had the I Told You shirt, obviously, because I'm a super fan, but to, like, go out and buy, like, even a wig for Tashi, don't got the funds for that. Also, we're all about sustainability on this channel, and I didn't want to go out and buy an outfit that I would maybe never use again. So that's why I'm dressed in this getup. Fun fact, I did go to Stanford shortly after Challengers came out, just like I was in San Francisco, stopped by Stanford, and I went to the gift shop and all of the tennis shirts were sold out. So my dreams of getting one of those and just wearing that for this video were kind of shattered. But this is a Stanford hat, and I figured it was Cunty Fierce Diva because it's cheetah print. And so yeah, I got my backwards cap on and I have curly hair. So we're just gonna pretend that I'm Art Donaldson. I'm also seeing that, yes, I'm blending into my couch a little bit, but we're just not gonna talk about that, okay? We're not gonna talk about that. We're not gonna acknowledge it. I mean, I have acknowledged it, but today we're here to talk about Art Donaldson. If Patrick's apparent antagonism is what makes him misunderstood, then I would argue Art's apparent protagonism does the same for him. I think Art is severely misunderstood by audiences for the same reasons that he misunderstands himself. I remember walking out of the theater after one of the 4, maybe 5 times I went to go see it in theaters, and overhearing 2 people talk about how the whole movie was just Art deserving better. I remember arguing with my friends after the same showing about why I disagreed when they expressed similar sentiments. I think there's a natural impulse to see Art as a victim. He's overshadowed by his talented best friend when he gets the girl, and when Art finally does get the girl, she cheats on him with said best friend who was also her ex. I'm definitely not denying that those circumstances are crappy, or saying that it's Art's fault that they happened to him. But why does Art supremely get the victim treatment when they all have cause to be victims? Tashi, for example, experiences a life-altering injury that destroys her possibilities of becoming a professional tennis prodigy. And Patrick loses his girlfriend, best friend, and chance at success seemingly all in one night, and not for his fault. Like, even though they have a fight before the match where Tashi has this life-altering injury, he's not the one that fucking smashed her knee in with a mallet. So it was an accident. No one's to blame. Not Tashi, not Patrick, not Art, in my professional opinion. Yet Patrick is labeled as the bad guy in this instance. Art, on the other hand, is the epitome of success, yet we feel bad for him more than the girl who lost her dream or the man living out of his car. I could argue that it's because, even on paper, Art represents the type of person that we're all societally expected to feel the most sympathy for. a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male who is also attractive, which is how he's described in the screenplay, by the way. But while I do believe part of this argument is definitely true, for the sake of this video, I also think there's another element of his character that elicits this response. If we hate Patrick because he behaves in all the ways we're not supposed to, then we love Art because he does exactly what he's supposed to. And we feel bad for him because despite his best efforts, things still don't go entirely his way. He's a victim of the people in his life whose mess seems to spill onto him and ruin his mask of perfection. Because that's all it is, folks, a mask. So perfect that even he mistakes it for himself. Maybe you see what I'm getting at now? That element of bisexuality that so clearly defines him? That's right, people. We're talking about repression. Okay, repression is certainly a very common queer experience in general, but it's also uniquely bi one in the sense that bisexuality is often invalidated as a real sexuality or identity, even within the queer community. And that way, even people that seem to fit all the criteria to identify as bisexual instead shut down the possibility of it at all. Also, to clarify, I don't believe there's any way to prove bisexuality. In fact, more than other monosexual identities, there's an unfair onus placed on bi people to prove it. Like, if you're a woman who identifies as bi but has never actually slept with another woman, other people who don't even know you think that they have the authority to call you straight. Yet, you can be a gay or straight virgin and still feel validated in your identity despite the fact that you never proved it by having sex with someone else. So the only bi criteria I'm referring to here is really an attraction to more than one gender. Because yes, actually, another interesting aside that I learned in my research, when the term first came into being, the bi and bisexuality meant two, but the two were not men and women, as we often assume, they are same and other. So, no, bisexuality is not transphobic, and it doesn't validate non-binary identities. That's just something that got filtered through our, strict gendered binary cultural language, if that makes sense. But when we regard sexuality as a spectrum, maybe some of you are familiar with the Kinsey scale, which is only one way to chart the spectrum, with 0 being fully straight and 6 being fully gay. Sexuality and the language people use to define their identities are obviously very complex, and I'm not trying to force an identity onto anyone. However, it is interesting to note that with this metric, which is admittedly outdated, the majority of the Kinsey scale, 1 through 5, could be called bisexual. Yet, people that fall within this range often don't refer to themselves this way. In a 2015 YouGov sexuality survey of roughly 2,000 participants in Germany, Israel, and the US, a fifth of people didn't believe that bisexuality existed. 28% of self-identifying heterosexuals and 20% of homosexuals indicated that there is no middle ground for sexuality. Surprisingly, 38% of these people identified as either a 3 or 4 on the Kinsey scale, seemingly denying the validity of their own desire. Sound familiar? Again, I understand that labels are complex, confusing, and don't mean everything, but this internalized biphobia and cultural bi-erasure remain relevant. It's not even that the term bisexual itself is what's important here, but that the act of denying it even exists shuts down the possibility of feeling that these people describe. So, a lot of bi people are repressed in one way or another, and Art Donaldson is definitely one of them. If Patrick represents an external perspective of bisexuality, then Art represents an internal one. It's pretty clear that Art is the one that most denies his bromance with Patrick. There's so much I don't even know where to begin when it comes to all the gay subtext between these two. I mean, Tashi knew these guys for all but a few hours and already clocked the connection between them, which of course Art promptly denies. Patrick's far-off look to Tashi's question in this moment encapsulates their relationship for me. Patrick has already made room for Art's denial, so what's the point of even acknowledging what he feels? Never mind that Patrick taught him to jerk off when they were 12, or that their beds are still pushed together all these years later. I mean, that's just what best friends do, right? We've all been there. I mean, that's completely normal best friend, straight dude stuff. I think the people in the YouGov survey, Art denies what he feels for Patrick because he doesn't believe that his attraction is actually valid. Art is prepared to make a choice because he believes he must. So he chooses Tashi. I don't believe that he chooses her merely to hide his feelings for Patrick either. Art is obviously very infatuated with her, even in their marriage. No. To erase his desire for Tashi would equally erase his bisexuality, which obviously I don't want to do. Bi men in particular are painted as two-faced, as though they're lying to themselves and their partners because they're not actually bi and attracted to women, like they're just secretly gay. It's so problematic on so many levels. Like, why do we always think, like with bi women, it's usually, the narrative's usually, oh, she's just experimenting, she doesn't actually like girls, she just likes men. But with bi men, it's like, oh no, he's actually secretly gay. And it's interesting that we always think that the people in those situations are attracted to men. Like, you can't be attracted to women in either scenario when you're bi. So obviously super problematic, and I'm not interested in that. Art is obsessed with Tashi. It's like so apparent, and he loves Patrick too. Though Art can probably admit that Patrick is attractive, I don't think he can admit anything beyond that. It's why when Tashi tells them she's not a homewrecker in response to them both asking for her number, Patrick claims they're in an open relationship, while Art argues they don't live together. Art only considers her comment literally, not interrogating what's beneath the surface of her statement. They don't live together, therefore there's nothing to wreck. In contrast, Patrick's response reveals that he knows what he and Art have, that he doesn't want to give it up, and that he wants Tashi too. What a whore. When it comes to desire, Art struggles. This is so apparent in the screenplay, where Tashi not only has to coach Art on the court, but in the bedroom. Maybe because his first sexual awakening was with his best friend coaching him through it. But yeah, way more apparent in the original screenplay, Art's struggle with desire, where a lot of the characters' traits are more emphasized before, I guess, becoming incorporated into like subtler acting decisions or directing decisions. For example, the fire and ice motif is way more relevant, even though it's only mentioned like once or twice in the 2006 timeline, just like offhandedly. Part of Patrick's fire is his desire to win and be the best, which makes him a mess to contend with. Art is more interested in control, in doing everything right and precise, like clean, crisp movements, even if it means losing. In fact, growing up Patrick's best friend and tennis partner meant that Art was used to losing, expected to lose, but still tried anyway, which made him better, which Tashi points out. Because of this perspective, Art doesn't have the same desire to win. He lacks fire, and so he relies on his sense of desire to come from Tashi, which Patrick points out in the movie in that alley scene where she slaps that damn cigarette out of his mouth. But here's the longer version in the original screenplay. But you can tell he's doing it for you, and you find that absolutely infuriating. More than infuriating, you find it disturbing, on a fundamental level that you're married to a guy who's not obsessed with squeezing every last inch out of his game. He's not a crazy person like you and me. He's not an addict. He's just a guy who wanted to do a really good job. And he's right. Art's struggle with desire is arguably the main point of tension in Art and Tashi's marriage. It's also something that I think a lot of people misunderstand about Art's arguably toxic behavior. It's an immense pressure on Tashi, one that she gladly takes on initially, sure, but I think that it begins to wear on her in their relationship and build resentment between them because Tashi's desire will never be enough if he continues to repress his own. In interviews, Zendaya has often called Challengers Codependency the movie because all of the characters need something from the others that they can't get themselves, and while I largely agree with this reading, I think that Art embodies this codependency the most. In another interview, for example, Mike Feist argues that Tashi and Patrick are more secure in themselves, which is, quote, a quality that just does not exist within Art. So there's just this adoration and admiration for the quality that they possess to the point of like, he wants to consume them. He kind of tries to become them through osmosis. And I think you can really see this in the ways that Art interacts when he's like with both Tashi and Patrick. Like when he's with Tashi, for example, diet is strict. When he's with Patrick, he's smoking cigarettes and eating whatever he wants. But also, I think in the sauna scene, you can really see Art trying to embody Tashi's mannerisms and how she talks to Patrick is how he tries to talk to Patrick, even though it's not natural for him, and you can still kind of see the mask slipping. Art has relied on both Patrick and Tashi to be the source of his desire and identity. He loved and admired Patrick so much that he was content to stay in his shadow if it meant he could keep looking up to him, aspiring to be him, wanting what he wanted. Because ultimately, even his attraction to Tashi was born from Patrick's attraction to her first, in the same way that Patrick taught Art to jerk off to the same girl that he fantasized about. Art's desire is almost always mediated by someone else's, because he constantly represses his own. I also think that this is where Art's anger comes from when they're older. It never made sense to me that Art ended his friendship with Patrick so abruptly after Tashi's injury, or that he would hold a grudge against him for so long. It seems like he's only angry at Patrick because Tashi's angry at Patrick. as though they both blame him for what happened to her. Going back to the sauna scene, Patrick points out that it's bullshit.
I mean, really, why are you so angry with me? Like, I don't buy that it's because of Tashi, or I don't think it's because of what happened to her. I think maybe you're still just really disturbed by the fact that she could have been into someone like me.
Art admits that it's true. He does find it disturbing. But that still doesn't explain his anger at Patrick to me. Instead, I think what Patrick also means to say is I think you're disturbed by the fact that you could have been into someone like me. In the same way that both Tashi and Art resent Patrick for exposing their desires, Art resents seeing his own desire reflected in his wife's past. Tashi's attraction to Patrick mirrors Art's, and though he can try to purge it from himself, he can't purge it from his wife, and he hates Patrick for it. Even his anger is a mask he wears to hide how he really feels. So Art may be a victim of Tashi and Patrick's adulterous shenanigans, but he's just as much a victim of himself. Art is a perfect example of what bi-repression often looks like. You can do everything right, grow up and make a choice, and still be haunted by the ghost of your adolescent desire years later. It can be confusing to be bi in a monosexual world. I mean, I've been out for years and I still occasionally struggle to validate my own desires. So I don't necessarily blame Art. I just also think he's a great case study for why bi-repression is so common and also why it doesn't work, even if it looks like it does. But interestingly, this quality of bisexuality being easily overlooked or buried brings me to the final element of bi-identity I want to explore. It's liminality. In Tashi Duncan we trust. Yes, this is my Tashi getup. These glasses are actually a pretty close fit, and obviously I'm going for the hotel room scene look. Don't have a cross necklace, but we got the Sagittarius bling bling. So that's what we're rocking with this one. I don't know how long I'll keep these glasses on. In fact, I think they're coming off right now, but appreciate the effort, dog. I'm doing what I can. And I'm excited to get into this section because I fucking love Tashi, and I figure who better to explore this theme of liminality than the girl herself. For one, of all the characters, Tashi is the least visibly bi. But hear me out. That's actually part of my case for her bisexuality. I've already mentioned that there's a dark history of bisexual people having to prove their bisexuality. For those seeking asylum from homophobic countries, for example, their sexual encounters with multiple genders, or only one gender, can both be used as evidence to negate their appeal, either taken as fabrication or used to justify their ability to just choose to be straight. So again, not interested in gathering concrete evidence. But even that kind of justification can be found in the way that Tashi considers tennis a relationship. She explains it to Art and Patrick on the beach as such regarding her match with Anna Mueller.
For about 15 seconds there, we were actually playing tennis. And we understood each other completely. So did everyone watching. It was like we were in love.
Even though she's describing a match with an opponent, it's telling that Tashi frames it in this way. To Tashi, tennis is a huge way for how she relates to people, if not the only way we actually see her doing so. It's not therefore inconsequential that she describes her relation to Anna in this way, as a fleeting love affair. But while I think this is a strong case for Tashi's bisexuality, it's the themes and motifs that make up Tashi's character that I still find incredibly bi. The fact that she doesn't look bi is one of them. There have actually been multiple studies and surveys to ascertain what bisexuality looks like. One sexuality researcher, Victoria Clark, found that her students could identify stereotypical descriptions of lesbians and gay men as either butch/masculine or fashionable/effeminate, respectively. But when it came to bisexuals, Clark's students only came up with a small number of associations for the word bisexual, mostly negative, like confused and greedy, and they had no clear image of the typical bisexual. Feminist researcher Nikki Hayfield also found in a 2020 survey of 20 self-identified bisexual women and 670 total participants that both the bisexual and non-bisexual participants could describe what lesbian, gay, and straight people looked like, but not bisexuals. In this way, most bi people struggle to present themselves visually because there's not one clear way to look bi. That doesn't mean bi people don't try, of course. Some of us opt for androgyny or incorporating elements of both straight and gay fashion. One woman, in another study about bi identity, described it in a way that I personally relate to. I think that the most important thing anyone should understand about bisexual women is that it's not just bisexual in terms of what you like, it's also bisexual in terms of who you are. It's this idea that gender expression and sexuality are related, which is a more common sentiment among bisexuals. You don't necessarily have to identify as non-binary, but dressing more feminine one day or more masculine another is one way of expressing an otherwise seemingly invisible sexuality. I mention this because I see some of that in Tashi. If you ever explore the Challengers fandom on Tumblr, it's a whole lot of baby girl art and dom Tashi. We never really see Tashi dressing in typically masculine ways, but she has an edge to her when it comes to the way she relates to the men around her. This isn't to say that Tashi isn't feminine, or that her power only comes from a masculine position, but it felt to me worth mentioning how Tashi is someone that embodies both of these qualities in the way she moves through the world. And this is part of what I'm getting at with the idea of liminality, which refers to the state of being in between two stages or places. It's often thought of as a transitional period or threshold, making it an ambiguous or precarious position to be in on the path of becoming something new. But what if that's where you permanently end up? As I've mentioned, many people already consider bisexuality a passing fancy, like it's some temporary process of experimentation on the journey to determine whether you're actually gay or straight. For some people that is the case, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for those of us that identify as bisexual, liminality is where we learn to live. Neither gay nor straight, but a secret third thing, means that bisexuals often feel caught between worlds. Tashi Duncan is a character that is intimately familiar with this position. For one, she's half black, and despite how funny it is to dunk on light-skinned people, there are unique challenges that come with being mixed race. If it wasn't obvious, I'm also half black, and I can acknowledge my light-skin privilege, but I also experienced racism within my own family, and yet I'm still asked to prove my blackness to others. I am still visibly black though, and so is Tashi, within this predominantly white world of tennis. While her race is rarely directly addressed, it is an essential part of understanding her character. Princess Weeks actually has a great video going more in depth into this idea of Tashi's race and the relevance of her character, and it's a great video, which I recommend, so I'll link it down below and you can check it out. There are a few interesting moments in the film where race does come into play. Who could forget the iconic
"I'm taking such good care of my little white boys,"
which still has me gagged to this day. So clearly Tashi thinks about the relevance of race. I mean, duh, in the first interaction she even has with Art and Patrick, she calls her opponent, Anna Mueller, a sore loser and a racist bitch. And then later that night, in the hotel room, she explains why she didn't go to a tennis academy like them. She couldn't afford it, and her parents didn't want her growing up in that kind of environment. The latter answer is vague and can be read in a lot of different ways. Maybe they didn't want her around boys like Art and Patrick, or maybe they didn't want to subject her to a toxic and competitive environment where her race and class could be used against her. Because yes, her class position is also relevant to her racial identity. Hopefully I don't need to explain how oppression is intersectional here, but what I'm getting at is that it's not just that Tashi is black, it's also that she's not rich, and those are intimately related. And in interviews, Zendaya even explains that Tashi comes from a different world and background than Art and Patrick do. Ultimately, tennis is her life because it has to be. There's nothing to fall back on. She's going to end up providing for herself, for her family. A lot of things that I can personally relate to. That's why it's so devastating when it's taken away from her. Her injury is just another way that she's flung into a liminal position. She goes from being a tennis prodigy to a retired athlete in a single moment, and the entire movie is her learning to navigate that. She never got to become the professional star she knew she would be, and though she becomes an incredibly successful tennis coach, she still mourns what never got to be. She's still a tennis player at heart, of course, but she can never truly play tennis again, and that's tragic. I think we can all understand that this tragedy shapes her character, but I still don't think it's emphasized just how much it frames everything she does. Like, so much of her struggle in the 2019 timeline of Challengers feels like Tashi clawing her way back from being Tashi Donaldson, the coach, to Tashi Duncan, the player, when really she's always somewhere between the two. Much in the same way that Tashi is somehow always between Art and Patrick. Without them, Tashi has no chance of becoming a player again, but without her, Art and Patrick have no way to express their feelings for each other. Ironically, both of these quests are actually about chasing that final moment of euphoric release, and in both instances, Tashi is directly in the middle. Being in the middle of Art and Patrick is its own liminal position for Tashi, because she's both a mediator and object of their desire. Tashi instantly clocks the connection between these two, and how much they've both repressed it, and enables them to act on it through her in a way. Luca describes this moment as not just about Tashi's erotic amusement, but her pushing them to be better people and own it, in the same way that she uses their attraction to her to make them better players. It's also another interesting moment where she's somewhere between a player and a coach. Yet it's this unique position that I think makes Tashi such a good representation of the liminality of bisexuality, including the sense of desire, because that's another thing about bisexuality that many people don't understand. Desire isn't just one day feeling straight and the next day feeling gay. I mean, actually, that is what it feels like, but the way that I've kind of rationalized my experience with it, like when you're bi and you go through this bi cycle, which Verily Bitchy has a great video about, that I can also link down below, you sometimes do go through these cycles of feeling one day gay or one day straight, but the only reason that you really have that experience is because we live in such a monosexually dominant world, so there's not a lot of room to experience this full feeling of desire. So really it's neither and it's both, always. At least for me, my attraction to one gender is colored by my attraction to another, even if they feel like distinct spheres. Which is why Patrick, and especially Art, depend on their desire for Tashi to explore their desire for each other. It's not that they're hiding behind Tashi, but that in this expansive feeling, the boundaries between all three of them are blurred, and the result is euphoric and erotic. I mean, I don't have to tell you that. Because bi people feel caught in this liminal position where they don't seem to belong to either world, being in bi spaces can produce the same expansive feeling. For instance, in 2008, social psychology researcher Helen Bowes Catton conducted fieldwork at the bisexual convention BiCon in the UK, in which her and her colleagues found that more than just a sense of belonging, the event made individuals feel a sense of euphoria and boundlessness, similar to a psychedelic experience. And this is what Art, Tashi, and Patrick all experience in that moment where they drop their guards and let loose their longing for each other in the hotel room. Obviously, the scene is incredibly sexy, but Luca argues that it's what the entire movie is really about. He says, they are acting out for 13 years the possibility of going back to that hotel room to find again that beautiful moment of burgeoning desires and innocence, and at the same time to feel at ease with one another the way they were there. So throughout the entire arc, that's what they're trying to do. And finally, with the rivalry at that heightened level, the triangle finally found itself sitting in the same place, but now on the court. Can I just say, he gets me. You know what? In Luca Guadagnino, we trust. But also, this is why the final 10 minutes of the movie are so amped. When Patrick places that ball in the center of the racket, signaling to Art what he likely already knew but didn't let himself believe, that Tashi cheated on him with Patrick, they both drop their masks. And though Tashi doesn't know what the fuck is going on in that moment, her mask falls too, as her hand is shown. Yet she relishes in the honesty between them because it allows them to finally play some good fucking tennis. It is in this moment that they understand each other completely. In a game about missing connections, about trying to trick or deceive your opponent for a point, their honesty with each other exposes all of their missed connections, and finally brings them back into each other's arms. And though Tashi's not on the court with them, she is, because she understands them completely in that moment too. She understands her role in getting them there, just like she did in that hotel room. Though she's sitting on the sidelines, another liminal position, her "come on!" is proof of her participation. Because challenges the traditional boundaries of what a relationship like tennis can be, that it can involve more than just a pair, that the observer may become a participant, that all the corners can touch. It's this last idea that I'm most excited to explore in the final section of this video. So obviously this fit is atrocious, but I wanted to combine all three of them because, that's right, we're talking about the throuple. Unfortunately, a large part of the reception I've seen for challengers has been a series of pointing fingers, deciding which character is the villain of the film. Because Tashi cheats on her husband, it's usually her name getting tossed around, with Patrick in tow for being her accomplice. Because of this, in interviews, Zendaya and Josh have both been quick to call out Art's sneaky behavior as the real villainy of this movie.
Me and Z get a lot of flack.
Yeah.
Right. And then when you see on second viewing and you're like,
Wait a minute.
Yet the screenwriter Justin Koritzkes has held firm on the argument that there are no villains in this movie. He says, I don't think about characters as being villains. You're trying to create people that feel real, and what that ends up meaning is that you create people who are as cruel and petty and kind and understanding and generous and mean as the people you meet in real life. I ultimately agree with this idea, that none of the characters are evil or inherently cruel. Yes, even Tashi, the adulterer that she is worthy of our sympathy and respect. Because Kritzky's is right, real people are messy. A 2005 study found that infidelity occurs in 25% of all marriages surveyed. Another study from 2011 similarly found that a quarter of men and a fifth of women had cheated on their current partner, regardless of whether or not they were married to each other. That's only their current partner. It may have felt like a glaring omission that I didn't address Tashi's cheating in her own section, yet it's no more glaring than the way we don't address cheating in real life. For a culture that argues monogamy is the only valid way to have a relationship, why do so many monogamists cheat? This is called the monogamy paradox, the paradox between monogamous intentions and high rates of infidelity, and it exposes a core issue at the heart of all of this. Of course, cheating is always a choice. Nobody has to cheat, and it's obviously a deplorable thing to do to the partner. Yet clearly just condemning that behavior doesn't do anything to actually solve it. It's important to consider why that choice continues to be made, despite the often catastrophic consequences. Why does Tashi cheat? Why does anyone? In a world where monogamy is seemingly the only viable option, there are few alternatives to exploring desire outside of it. In our conservative, moralistic society, we tell people to just control themselves and repress their desire, and when they inevitably fail, we consider it a moral failing rather than a cultural one. But the truth is that for some, monogamy just doesn't work, and the denial of this is the fertile soil from which cheating blooms. That's why Tashi isn't the villain of Challengers, nor is Patrick, or even Art. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The real villain of Challengers is heteronormativity and compulsory monogamy. I don't think these terms need to be explained, but just in case, the former refers to the assumption that heterosexuality is the natural sexual orientation of human beings. Compulsory monogamy is related to this idea, in the sense that monogamy is considered an ideal of heterosexual relationships. This term was first coined by Adrienne Rich in 1980 in connection to comphet, compulsory heterosexuality, but here's a quote from gender studies scholar Angela Willey, which expands on it. To say that monogamy is compulsory is to call attention to constraints on our ability to imagine alternatives. The visibility of alternative relationship models can challenge monogamy's grip on our imaginations, but it can also reinforce its status. Julia Shaw clarifies in her book, in other words, it is important to see other forms of relationships so that we perceive these as options for ourselves, and we must be careful not to treat non-monogamy as a deviant alternative to be mocked. Essentially, Art, Tashi, and potentially even Patrick fail to see the possibility of a relationship that includes all of them, even though I believe that this is what they all want. Like when Patrick first hooks up with Tashi, Art tells him, I just don't want to feel left out. And his sense of being left out is what I believe pushes him to try and manipulate them both as a way to get back in. Yet, none of them are ever really fully pushed out anyway. The other is always a ghost between them. Patrick and Tashi literally hook up in her dorm room while discussing how talented and attractive Art is, and before Tashi and Art make out in the Applebee's parking lot, they first have to step around the void left by Patrick's absence. And then, when Art and Patrick meet in the sauna, they both address having been with Tashi at one point or another. There's no two without the other. They all need each other, even when they attempt to deny it. This is that codependency that Zendaya was talking about. Here's the full quote from an interview with Rotten Tomatoes. Codependency the movie. I say that because all these characters are searching for something out of life that they can't get on their own and ultimately ties them to each other. And I think that can be dangerous. It can be toxic. It can be many things. And we watch that kind of play out in their life. We watch them avoid dealing with their own pain, dealing with their, for lack of a better word, bullshit. And in order to cover for that, they use each other and they lean on each other or seek qualities out of each other that they don't possess naturally themselves. That's where the codependency stuff starts going. I really don't think they can be alone. I agree with Zendaya. I don't think these characters can be without each other, but I also think that the toxic codependency we see in the movie is a symptom of their denial for each other. Zendaya argues that they need each other in unhealthy ways, but I'd argue it's largely unhealthy because of the constraints they've placed on themselves. Like with tennis as the main metaphor of relationships within the film, there can only ever be two players, and competition is the path to love's reward, which is built on deceiving your opponent. As such, these characters never just allow themselves to be together and explore what they feel. except for that initial moment in the hotel room. This scene wasn't even in the original script. Luca made it clear to Koritsky's that in a love triangle, you want all the corners to touch, which is interesting because I think in our cultural imagining, we tend to think of a love triangle as two typically male love interests, both pursuing the same typically female person, a la Twilight or even the Hunger Games. Of course, this would be the typical configuration in a heteronormative monogamous society where only one lover can prevail. Even though, side note, ContraPoint's phenomenal Twilight video actually points out that the love triangle allows for a polyfantasy to occur among monogamists without shame or judgment. Bella doesn't ask for these two incredibly sexy men to be in love with her after all, but what's a girl to do? The reader, Bella, Stephanie Meyer, whoever, can essentially indulge in the fantasy of having two love interests without actually being deviant enough to take two lovers. But Luca Guadagnino, genius that he is, says otherwise. We discussed a lot about how we could flesh out the basic point that the triangle is not just two people after one, but the corners touch together all the time. You're not jealous of your girlfriend or your boyfriend. You're jealous because you're not chosen by one and you're losing the other. In presenting this much more, I'll say it, geometrically accurate representation of a love triangle, the film exposes the limitations we place on love itself. That it can only flow in one direction or meet in a single point is absurd. But the fact that the love triangle even exists as a trope reveals a cultural fascination with the idea of loving more than one person at a time, while the boundaries around it restrict the possibility of actually indulging in such an experience within a monogamous society. That's why the love triangle is always framed as a competition, in which only one lover can win. Except for in Challengers, where the winner of the match at the end of the film is intentionally ambiguous, because it doesn't matter who wins. What matters is that they're reunited. That's the only real reward. Now, I'm not just talking about this because I'm obsessed with these characters and their weird little fucked up romance. I mean, obviously I am, but there's a point to all of this, which is that often bisexuality and polyamory go hand in hand. Not always, of course. We are not a monolith. But in a 2014 study regarding attitudes toward monogamy, compared to monosexuals, bisexual people found monogamy to be more of a sacrifice. This doesn't mean that bisexual people were against monogamy, just that bisexual people considered it less of a holy grail of relationships. And I think there's something to this with Art, Tashi, and Patrick. Though they may not always realize it, Art and Tashi make plenty of sacrifices to be monogamous, with Patrick being only one of them. The relationship remains adversarial at times, because Art admits, in the screenplay at least, that he knows he's been playing for Tashi's number for the last 13 years. In doing so, Art still considers Tashi the prize, putting her on a pedestal that means he can never see her or himself clearly. And maybe Tashi has to sacrifice never letting herself be seen clearly in order to justify it all. But by the end of it, these two clearly resent each other, because in order to be together, they have to spare each other and themselves the honesty of what/who they really desire. But much in the same way that bisexuality challenges the status quo of what attraction is normal or natural, non-monogamy pushes the potential of this attraction beyond its natural limits. You know what? I'll say it. This is the future liberals want. That's my bi agenda. It's also the real reason why I love this fucking movie. I mean, not only is it an incredibly sexy, fun time, but it also speaks to something incredibly real and personal to me. My experiences as a bisexual freak are validated by these three bisexual freaks. Their struggle toward honest desire with each other and themselves is one I can relate to, and one I'm honestly not used to seeing reflected in a piece of media as popular as this one. I know a lot of people won't see this movie in the same way I do, but hey man, that's not my problem. In the same way it's not my problem to prove my bisexuality to anyone. Whether you believe it or not, Challengers challenges our cultural imagining of identity, desire, and relationships. And honestly, what's more bisexual than that? If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Really happy you're here. Thank you so much for sticking it out with me for my first YouTube video. I'm sure there are so many just little errors and bumps along the road, and I really made this more for myself than anything, but I appreciate that you took the time to experience this with me, and please feel free to leave a like or a comment. Challengers Nation rise, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you around in the future in other unhinged videos. Bye!